First of all, thanks a lot for the local organizing committee and also the International Scientific Committee for offering me the possibility to show recent data from our lab. As you can see, I'm a pretty old guy, so I will not show you brand new methodology, brand new techniques. I will just try to ask very basic questions and give you some answer with classical methodologies. So the first question I would like to address is, what is auditory perception? Because I assume everybody in this room will be interested by that. And I don't have an answer, but I can propose that to perceive, it's to categorize. And it's not a new idea. It's something that stemmed from a long time ago when people start to consider that categorization, in fact, is a very the basis for any cognitive abilities. And this has been stated a long time ago, 20 years ago, by Stephen Arnott, a big guy in cognitive science, in fact. So I can also propose that perception involves two operations, if you want, discrimination and categorization. And we can do both at the same time. We just don't do one, then the other. We discriminate and categorize. For example, to give you an example, I can recognize it's a voice, and at the same time, I can determine which voice it is among all these heavy metal singers that are present in this slide. So it's pretty amazing, but it's a lot of training involved, in fact. We can do that even in very, very noisy situations. Some of these situations cannot be avoided if you live in a large city, but other situations are like yesterday evening. So we apparently enjoy this situation, and sometimes we really love this situation, in fact. So the question, next question is, where are the mechanisms allowing the discrimination and categorization in this very high noise level? And probably the answer that all of you have in mind is it's in the auditory cortex. And indeed, there's an incredible amount of paper saying that there's a robust representation in the auditory cortex or noise invariant representation in the auditory cortex. There's many sentences like that in the title. And I'm taking a big risk here because most of the authors of this paper are in this room. So I hope they will not be too mad at me from showing these papers. And in fact, I will try to show you today that we got some data that challenge this view. And there will be two parts in the talk. One part with electrophysiological recordings at several levels in the auditory system. And the second part with mostly behavioral studies and a little bit of electrophysiological recording at the end. So the first part of the talk would be Samira Soufi's PhD when she recorded the response to communication sound in noise at different levels of the auditory system, primary and secondary auditory cortex, auditory thalamus, central nucleus of the inferior colliculus, and cochlear nucleus. And she recorded the response to these neurons to 4 communication sounds that are very similar. So it's 4 whistles from guinea pigs. And I insist on the fact it's already a very difficult discrimination in silence, because they more or less have the same fundamental frequency. They are in the same frequency range, if you want, and they also have the same harmonics. And they mostly differ by their temporal envelope, and you will see the temporal envelope on the next slide. And she inserted these 4 vocalizations in 2 noise, stationary noise and chorus noise. So the situation looked like this. And you can see here at minus 10 dB SNR that there's very few acoustic cues allowing the discrimination between these communication sounds. And if you wonder why the stationary noise is made of stripes like that, it's because it's matched. The spectrum of this stationary noise matches the chorus noise. So there's another representation of some frequency band. So she quantified the mutual information as an index of neuronal discrimination. And if you do that, maybe you cannot see very clearly the rasters on this plot, but you can see the different stimulus envelope on the bottom of this slide. And if you quantify the mutual information based on individual recording, on the population of recording simultaneously recorded, you can see that the value of mutual information is much higher in the cochlear nucleus, inferior colliculus, and auditory thalamus compared to the two cortical area. And this is more or less the same thing in noise, in fact. So if you look this raster, you don't see much. But if we concentrate on this inferior colliculus recording that Samira particularly like, you can see that there's a very striking responses at plus 10 dB, 0 dB of SNR, and even some responses at minus 10 dB. So it seems to be very robust. And if you look here, the group data, you can see that all the value of mutual information decrease. It's normal, totally normal, and at the individual and at the population level. But you can see that the highest value remain at the subcortical level, for the subcortical structure, in fact. So, in fact, it's a little bit ambiguous if you look carefully here, because you can see in the cortex, the situation is like that. So you can wonder if the cortex is not the most resistant to noise, because it starts here and it's only decreased slightly toward most of them the same value than some subcortical structure, even if the inferior colliculus is still the highest value. But so you can consider the cortex is resistant to noise, but in fact it's simply because the value, the initial value is very low. So in fact I consider that okay, it's resistant to noise because it starts by very low level and it cannot go further down. So it's a byproduct of its poor discriminative abilities in noise, in fact. So why the subcortical auditory response display better resistance to noise? There's probably many factors that are involved, but we suggest that it's potentially because the subcortical neurons have better tracking abilities, including in the presence of noise. So to quantify this, we quantify the correlation between the neural responses and the stimulus envelope. And if you look here, if you look here, if you look, okay, if you look here, the correlation with the auditory nerve fiber, the cochlear nucleus, and the inferior colliculus is pretty high. It's got a little bit down for the auditory thalamus and further down for the cortical auditory structure, the two cortical area. And in fact, if you quantify the amount of decrease of the correlation between neural response and stimulus envelope, it's proportional to the decrease in mutual information. So the further you reduce the correlation between neural response and stimulus envelope, the further you decrease the mutual information, and this is represented on this picture. For whatever the structure, it's one of the explanations why subcortical auditory structure are better resistant to noise. So you might think that mutual information is not the greatest way to quantify the cortical robustness or the robustness to noise in general. So Samira has the idea to use totally different tools to quantify the robustness to noise. And it's a tool that was developed by David Schneider and Sarah Boulet. So they take the response to a clean vocalization in quiet and the response to noise. And then you look at the response to vocalization in noise. And you ask a classifier to classify this vocalization as, is it closest from the response here or here? And so you get, here you get an index of 1. And here, if you have a response that looks like the noise, you get an index of -1. So we ask a linear classifier to classify the response in 5 categories, from the robust, resistant, to the most sensitive to noise. And we obtain, so this is the 1,500 recordings that Samira has collected during her PhD. And so this is the class of robust neuron, the resistant neuron, so a small fraction of the whole population. And if you split this population into the brain area, you would get this picture with the inferior colliculus neuron, where you found the more robust and resistant neuron. That doesn't mean there's no robust and resistant neuron in the cortex, but it represents a small fraction of the cortical population compared to the inferior colliculus, in fact. So, first conclusion is, in noisy situation, in fact, the discriminative ability seems to be low in the auditory cortex compared to the thalamic and brainstem level. So this was, for me, it was, and for us, it was quite convincing, but in fact, it was not convincing enough for the reviewer and editor in high-profile journal. And they mostly said, it's passively listening, and in addition, it's anesthetized animal. So maybe things could have been different in awake animal, and maybe things could have been drastically different if the animal was behaving. So I ruminate for a while, this comment, and I decided to attack the same problem from another side and to move to a behaving animal. So there will be two sections. One is the auditory cortex really necessary for discriminating between communication, sound, and noise, and how look like the response of auditory brainstem neurons during the task. So we designed exactly the same, the task with exactly the same stimuli that Samira was using. So this is the PhD thesis of Alexandra Martin, and she will have a poster tomorrow morning, so she will love to give more explanation on this if I miss some details. And so we use exactly two of the vocalization that Samira was using. In fact, we select the two closest one, so the two most similar vocalization, similar fundamental frequency, similar frequency range, and so on. And one was used as CS+, and the animal has to lead to the stimulus, and the animal has not to lead to the other stimulus. And we insert, we first train the animal, the mice, in clean vocalization when we insert this vocalization in the same stationary and chorus noise than Samira has been using. Alexandra wants a control group, so we add a control group. I will not give any result on this control group. If you have questions, I can answer, but she will answer tomorrow at the poster. We have a control group of mice that were simply exposed. So there was a head-fixed mice here that is performing the task, and next to it, there's a passively exposed mice that is not thirsty, not doing any task, just sitting and listening the same stimuli than the trained mouse. And so this is the performance of a single mice and an individual performance. So you get the first session and the two last sessions of each blocks. This is over 4 months of training. So you get the first session with the CS+, two last sessions, first session in discrimination, two last sessions, and first session in the plus 10 dB noise, two last sessions, and so on. And you can see that it's only when we arrived at minus 10 dB of SNR that the performance significantly dropped below the 75% of correct response to the plus and minus. It's exactly the same performance in terms of D prime, and we plot the D prime of 1 is on this dashed line. So you can see the performance drop until minus 10 dB SNR, and surprisingly, this mouse was performing quite well in chorus noise. So now, if we look at group data, so it's not all the animal Alexandra has run. She ran almost 40 animals, I think now. But on the first group of animal, you can see that you have heterogeneous performance, but the animal were pretty good until this minus 10 dB SNR. And some of them recover pretty good performance in chorus noise. Some of them fell at minus dB SNR in the chorus noise. So now we try to inactivate the auditory cortex. We do that with mucimol. So it can seem very odd and old-fashioned to use mucimol at the time of optogenetics. But in fact, I've worked on mucimol diffusion more than 20 years ago. So I quite know a little bit the drug concentration, volume, and time of diffusion. So we do a control solution, so phosphate buffer saline solution. And then on the same mice, the next day, we do mucimol. And of course, we record in the auditory cortex to make sure that the auditory cortex is silent. We try several concentration, even if I knew already which concentration we can use, we check several concentration. We use this concentration because we can have the cortex silent in about 10 minutes, and it lasts for more than 2 hours. And in the whole, so we use a neuronexus probe, so we can make sure that even the deepest layer of the cortex are silent. And then, so this is the protocol. Monday is retraining, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. So we alternate between conditions. And this is the first animal, Alexandra, the best animal, first animal that really make the whole task. So in the center, you have the performance day prime in quiet condition, and in both sides, you have the performance for increasing level of noise. And I don't think we need statistics to claim that there's no statistical difference between the musimal and the PBS session. So now if you look the animal that were trained on multiple time in alternance with PBS musimal, PBS musimal, this is all the animals. So we have pre-surgery training because we need to do a craniotomy to apply the PBS or the musimal solution. So this is the attenuation, the slope of the attenuation induced by the noise, the increased level of noise before surgery. This is during the PBS solution, and this is during the musimal solution. So not only there's no significant difference at each of these conditions, but also the slope of the attenuation induced by the increasing level of noise is the same. And this is in the chorus noise. The previous slide was on stationary noise. So in chorus noise, this is the pre-surgery, this is the PBS condition, and this is the musimal condition. So no difference at any of these for any of these noise condition, and no difference between the slope of the attenuation in the day prime performance. So all of you know that it's better to get positive result. Difficult to publish negative results. So we decide to have more fun with these animals, and we decide to inactivate the inferior colliculus with musimal. So exactly the same techniques, PBS, musimal, PBS, musimal for all the animals. And it's exactly the same animal that we have used for the cortex. So we inactivate the cortex, get negative results. So we did a craniotomy above the IC and did the same experiment. And this is the result. So this is the pre-surgery level of performance. This is the PBS level, and this is the musimal condition. So here, not only we have a statistical difference between the PBS and the musimal condition, but we also have a different slope of attenuation of the performance induced by the increasing level of noise. And don't tell me that the animal is deaf, because here the animal can perform at above 1.3, I think, in quiet condition. And in fact, here and here, the animal is responding to the plus and the minus randomly. So it's not like it stopped leaking, it's leaking to the plus and minus randomly. A better way maybe to visualize the effect of inhibiting the auditory cortex and the inferior colliculus, it's to plot the difference between the PBS condition and the musimal performance, so PBS and musimal performance for paired session. So with the same animal, if you compare, if you make the difference between the two conditions, same mice, but what we are tested multiple times, in fact. So the blue triangle have auditory cortex, and this purple are for the IC. And you can see that for auditory cortex, there's not that much difference between PBS and musimal. You can see that for the IC, there's already some decrease in performance in quiet, but there's a much stronger decrease in performance for all the noise condition. Okay. So there's many different, all the inactivation techniques are positive and negative aspect. This is beautifully summarized in a paper by Jennifer Bisley and her colleagues. So the problem of musimal diffusion, obviously, it's true. We probably don't inactivate only primary, secondary auditory cortex. Probably we also activate the posterior parietal cortex, the cingulate cortex. We activate a range of area. We know for sure we don't inactivate the subcortical auditory structure because we check in the auditory thalamus and inferior colliculus, but recordings are fine. So we activate a large part of the cortex, and the animal were still performing the task. You might think it's a crappy technique, but it's the same crappy technique we use for the cortex and for the IC, and we get different results. Okay? So it's on the same animal, you get no effect in the cortex, you get an effect in the IC. And finally, it's true, but it's really overtrained animal. So the animal were trained for 4 months, then craniotomy, then retrain, and they reach the same level of performance, and then you apply the drug. So probably this animal were massively overtrained, and potentially the situation could be different if you inactivate the cortex either during the initial discrimination or, even more interesting, during the first session in noise. So maybe the cortex was necessary for acquiring the discrimination in noise, and we don't know that, and it will be very interesting to know if it's the case. But I think it's important. And why it's important? Because we are overtrained animal. We are massively overtrained animal. And I think 90% of our perceptive abilities rely on overtraining. So I think only 10% of our perceptual ability goes up to the cortex and goes down to make decisions about what we feel, what we perceive. So I think it's quite important to know that maybe we don't need the cortex for the most basic thing that we perceive all times. Maybe it's unconscious perception, I don't know. What's going on during the task? Nothing really exceptional, very classical results during the task. So it's recording in the inferior colliculus, and we find a higher frame rate for the CS plus than the minus, both in quiet condition, but also in all the SNR condition. So it was a systematic higher frame rate for the CS plus. We also get higher frame rate for the hit, for the miss. So you may think it's a correlation with the level of attention to the stimulus. Maybe the animal was paying more attention to the stimulus when he was giving a hit compared to a miss. But in fact, you can also consider that it's potentially because the IC responses were related to the motor command, the execution of a movement, because the animal has to leak to the plus. And in fact, we also had a higher frame rate for the hit than for the false alarm. So in that case, the animal is making a response, but the response is stronger for the hit than for the false alarm. So we think it's not related, it's not tightly linked to the motor command. It's rather linked to the significance of a sound and not to the motor command. So based on our data, we can say that the auditory cortex doesn't cease necessary for the discrimination of communication sound, even in very challenging situations like very loud noise. And in the same mice, IC seems necessary. And the IC neuron firing rate seems to be related with the learned significance of a sound, not with the discrimination performance, in fact. So we are not the first one to show that IC neurons are really important for cognitive aspect. There's a paper by Jan Snoep and colleagues that said that IC neurons are sensitive to natural sound texture, but not auditory cortex neuron. The lab of Stephen David showed that the task engagement improved the discriminability of IC neuron in ferrets and marmoset. And recently, there's a very nice paper by Jennifer Lawlor and Kishore saying that IC neuron encode vocalization categories, which is a property that we suspect to be present only at the cortical level. So to come back to my original question, what are the mechanisms and where are these mechanisms allowing discrimination and categorization in high noise level? I think you all know that there are massive feedbacks from the cortex to the subcortical auditory structures. We all know they are important in some situations, And I think when we learn new tricks for perceiving, we probably need the cortex, okay? But once we have learned these tricks, and we just use this trick for perceiving and for daily life, we probably don't need the cortex anymore. At least it's my conclusion. And I would like to thank a few people, Léo Varnet and Christian Lorenzi, which were involved in Samira Soufi's project. Brice Batelier, Thomas Deneux, and Myriam Ziadi were involved in the first step of behavioral studies, and I thank Brice for sharing part of his equipment initially. And Elise Much was helping Alexandra for the inactivation study. And we should remember this man because he is probably one of the reasons we are here, because he started these auditory cortex meetings. And thank you for your attention.
There.
Hi, thanks very much. This was very nice. So my question is, first of all, I tend to agree with you that, when it's not learning, the auditory cortex may not be necessary, and it's not necessary also when it's not difficult. But what's surprising is the result in the inactivation of the inferior colliculus in quiet. So to me, it's kind of an obligatory auditory hub. And so where do you think that discrimination signal then comes from? Is it from the cochlear nucleus?
Why not? I think you have the auditory nerve, cochlear nucleus, superiorly very complex, lateral lemniscus. There's plenty of neurons for the discrimination. So I'm not surprised. It could be that very, very low in the auditory system, you have a few neurons that are sensitive enough to make the discrimination. In quiet condition, in noise, it's more difficult for them to dissect the plus and minus. But yeah, I'm surprised also. I was thinking, I was really expecting the animal to be impaired severely, even in quiet. And by the way, we wait much longer for the IC inactivation, so Alexandra wait half an hour to make sure that we get really the whole IC silent.
Yeah, I've actually two-part question. In the cochlear nucleus, which subdivision did you record from, ventral or dorsal?
I think in Samira's study, it was mostly dorsal division. Yeah.
Okay. And in the cortex, did you inactivate one hemisphere or both?
Oh, we inactivate one hemisphere, but the animal was deaf on the other side.
Yeah, but still both hemispheres will respond.
Possible.
So what would happen if you inactivate both hemispheres?
No, I don't know.
Yeah. What do you speculate?
Same result.
Thank you, Jean-Marc. Sorry to cut that short. Please find him after.